Hello, anthropology students. This is the start of your PowerPoint on language and communication. I will start with three important definitions. The first one being communication. Communication is really broad. It includes language, but it includes much more. It is the process of sending and receiving messages. Any message. So even animals can communicate between themselves and with humans. So this is giving you an idea of how broad is communication. Emojis are example of that. It's clearly communication, but it is not language. It is not as complex as a language. On the left side, you see man in Peru wearing blankets. This is an example as well of communication. The designs on the blankets you see on their back is a representation of their patrilineage. So you can, if I know the situation, the culture, I will identify their patrilineage by looking at their blanket. So this is communication. You send a message, people understand, but it cannot be really complex. I cannot express a complex idea with that. You will see elements later on in this PowerPoint that make a language a true language, and this involves complexity. So a language is much more complex. A language is a code. This is important. This word is important to remember. A language is a code, and in order to be using the language, you have to know the code. It's a set of symbols and signs with meanings you have to learn because it is very complex. Languages can be written, they can have a written aspect, but not necessarily. Some languages just have the oral aspect of it, and it is still a language. Symbols and signs are not written, they're heard and voiced. A dialect is a variety of a language, and sometimes we use this word the wrong way. Sometimes I hear people using the word dialect to describe a language that is kind of exotic, spoken in another country by a tiny amount of people. So if I tell people, oh, I come from Zimbabwe, and then they ask me, oh, what's your native dialect? I don't speak a dialect, I speak a language. So everyone speaks a language and speaks a variety of it. And this variety is a dialect. Speakers from different dialects of the same language are supposed to understand each other. If they do not understand each other, then we can think, oh, maybe it's a different language. They're supposed, with some efforts, to understand each other. Dialects can be linked with regions or countries. For example, French-Canadian language is a dialect of French. It's not the same French as the French spoken in Africa or the French spoken in France or in Belgium. These are different dialects. Even sometimes different regions of Quebec will have their local French. These are still dialects. Dialects can be linked with different groups. It can be age groups. You will hear teenagers sometimes speaking their own flavor of English. We can consider that sometimes a dialect. Also, in Philippines, for example, there is what we call a gay dialect. There is a language spoken by the LGBT community that is different from the local language. And this language is getting popular right now. It's filtering to the general population, but it has been created specifically by the LGBT community. This is a dialect. It's a dialect of the local language. Sometimes an ethnic group will have their own separate dialect. A good example of that is African American English. It is totally English, but it's a different English. It's a dialect. We will continue with linguistics and the way it's linked with culture a little bit by seeing two major components of languages. The smallest component of any language is called phoneme. A phoneme is a sound. Languages do not use all possible sounds that are possible to produce with the human body. I don't know if you have the opportunity to hear small babies. They produce a lot of sounds and crazy sounds, and very quickly they learn what is okay or not okay in their native language, and they lose the ability to produce and even hear some details in phonetics. Also, languages do not combine sounds the same way. We'll take the example of Spanish here. Spanish is a language that uses not a lot of phonemes. Now, my notes are at the college, so I don't know the exact number of phonemes used in Spanish, and it's not the same number in Spain and in Latin America, but it's between 25 and 30 different sounds used in Spanish. There are more sounds used in English and even more used in French, to use examples of languages you know better. Also, for the combination of phonemes, we'll still take the example of Spanish. I don't know if you have Spanish speakers among your friends, but ask them to pronounce a word that starts with ST like student or SK like skeleton. It can be pretty hard for some Spanish speakers because it's impossible in Spanish. You put an E before, esqueleto, student. So it's really hard. So your brain, when you're really young, connects in ways that will make it very hard to produce and even to hear certain phonemes. This is linked with culture. This is linked with your native language. Morphemes are parts of words. They're not syllables, they're different because every morpheme of a word has a meaning. In some languages, there is one word for every morpheme or one morpheme for every word. But in most languages, in most human languages, words contain many, at least two, meaning-bearing units. So words can be broken down into smaller elements that mean something. Example in English, books. If I say books, it's a word. It has one syllable, and I don't care about syllables here. It has two morphemes. The first morpheme is book. It means something, it means an object. And there's the S that means many of them. So two morphemes, two meaning-bearing units in one word. We can classify human languages on a spectrum depending on how they organize morphemes to create words. At one very end of the spectrum, there are isolating languages. Isolating languages tend to have very short words and tend to have words that will not include a lot of morphemes. And sometimes they will even have one separate word for every morpheme. One of the most isolating languages in the world that I chose as an example is Chinese. In Chinese, most words contain only one morpheme, one meaning-bearing unit. Example for they will say ta men. Now I'm sorry to my Chinese students, my pronunciation must be really terrible. I have no clue how to pronounce that. But here in this case, the ta means the third person and man means plural. So to say they, there are two characters or two different words, each one having corresponding to one morpheme. At the center of this spectrum, we have what we call synthetic languages. Synthetic languages have longer words that may include many morphemes. Some words will still include one morpheme, but it's possible to have many morphemes, 2, 3, 4, in one word. A good example is French, Spanish, Italian, Latin languages are synthetic. For example, in French, if I want to say I will talk, I say parlerai. So will talk, you need two words to say that in English. Each one having one morpheme is only one word in French. Parlerai. Parle means talk, and ai at the end means future. So you see here that English is more isolating as a language than French. At the opposite end of the spectrum, you have what we call agglutinative languages. They are called like that because they juxtapose many morphemes in the same word. They agglutinate, they glue morphemes together. I do not speak any agglutinative language, but Turkish is an example, Japanese is an example, German is an example. You know, German words can be really long and include many meaning-bearing units. The example you have on the slide here is in Finnish, the language spoken in Finland, which I will not even try to pronounce, and you don't have to learn that example. But you see some words can be very, very long and include many morphemes. Now it is time to link language and culture. And I will start with a theory called the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. That's a well-known theory that says that your native language will affect the way you think, will affect your mental categories, and the way you perceive the world. Sapir and Whorf were two linguists working together, and they go pretty far in their theory. I think they go too far, but it's a matter of opinion. They say that native language will define someone's perception of the world. I would say it influences how we perceive the world. And the third bullet in the slide here is a quote from their when they published their theory. One example of that is in French. In French, nouns, have gender. Every noun is either feminine or masculine, even if it's not alive, even if it's not a person. So when I see an animal, I will perceive, as a French speaker, this animal as a girl or a boy. It's not conscious. It's not voluntary. It's the way my brain is structured because of my native language. I remember something when I was young. I was about, I don't know, 7, 8 years old. I was at the zoo with my parents. And that's true what I'm telling you here. Don't laugh at me. And I saw a giraffe. And the giraffe was looking the other way. And I saw the testicles of the giraffe. And apparently, I don't remember that, but my parents told me I started to cry because this was impossible. I knew what these balls meant. I knew what they were. And for me, a giraffe could not be a boy. It was impossible. My whole universe was not working here. Because I'm not crazy, I'm just French. It's because in my brain, giraffes or mice are girls, because it's a feminine noun in French. Another example of that is in, I do not remember the name of that language. It's in my notes at school. It's one of the many Aboriginal languages in Australia. There is no words in that language for left or right. they replace it by a cardinal point, east, west, north, or south. And cardinal points are extremely important. So you will hear greetings like when they greet each other, instead of saying, "How are you?" they say, "Where are you going?" "Oh, I'm going north or south." This is the way they greet. And they use a cardinal point instead of left or right. So you will hear something like, "Or your shoelace is undone, north foot." So instead of left foot. It comes from their past as hunter-gatherers, where they have to orient themselves really well in nature. And this specific aspect of their language makes them really aware of their situation in space. We have seen already that our native language can influence how we see the world, can even influence our cultural aspects. But the other way around is also true. Our culture, the way our society is organized, will have a tremendous influence on our language, depending on our values, beliefs, our social environment, our cultural environment, our natural environment. You often hear that the Inuit have many words for snow. It's probably true. I don't know these words, but we have a few words in English for snow. It's less important to us in our daily lives. A similar example is the word potato in English. We have one word for potato, or maybe French fry when you fry it, but not a lot, because potatoes are not really important here. But in the Andes, in highland Peru, where people speak Quechua, uh, potatoes are extremely important because it's at the very center of their subsistence and economy. They will eat potatoes for breakfast, lunch, and dinner every day. Uh, so this word is so important, and they have many words for potato. For example, a potato is amca or papa. When they are baked, they're called watia. When they are dry freeze, raw, they're chuño, but carapulcra if they're cooked. The small yellow potatoes are oyucos, but the big yellow potatoes are kumar. And I don't know how many dozens of words they have for potatoes because it's so important for them. So they have, these many words. This is true in a lot of languages. What's important in your culture is linked with a very rich vocabulary. Same thing for the words we need in our daily lives. Example, in United States, there is a category of students, we call them freshmen. You're probably aware of that because you're English speakers. But when I first moved from Montreal to the States to teach about 15 years ago, I met, at the beginning of my stay, I met a young girl on campus, and she told me, "I'm a freshman." And I had no clue what she meant, and I was puzzled, because clearly she looked like a girl, and I know how fresh she was, but it didn't make sense to me. And then someone told me freshmen are first-year students. And in the States, much more than here, your first year of college is a very important step of your life, because it is when you leave your parents, you go live on dorms. That's a very important social category in the United States. Another example of that is the word in Wolof, the word njuli. This means a boy that has just been circumcised but has not healed yet. We have no word for that in English. We don't need a word for that. But in Wolof and in countries where this language is spoken in West Africa, that's an important social category you belong to when it happens to you. In other words, you are going through the second phase, the transition phase of a rite of passage. And there is a word for that because it is very important culturally, and it's not here. So the way culture is organized has a big influence on how languages are organized. As you know already, There are a written version for most languages in the world, and there's the spoken version of all languages. Written languages are the ones we learn in school. They are standardized, they are official, and everyone uses the standard form, the correct form of the written language. Everyone is supposed to use the same form of written language. So the prime minister, lawyers, professors, and your younger siblings will use the best they can the exact same version of a written language. This written version of a language does not change through time. Or yes, it can change, but really, really slowly. Changes have to be approved by academies and get integrated officially in new version of dictionaries. So it is a slow process, and written languages tend to stay static through time. But spoken languages are alive. First, there are many versions of the same spoken language. And if there is always a standard form, there is a standard French, there is a standard English, but it is used by a minority of people. When I speak French to my family, when I teach in French, I'm not using the standard French. It's too hard and long. I use my personal version of spoken French. Only those who read the news on TV, lawyers, politicians will use, not even always, the standard form of a spoken language. Also, spoken languages are alive. They change very, very quickly. Within one generation, spoken language can change. Another important aspect of spoken languages that we don't realize is that these languages follow very precise rules. They're not official grammatical rules, but they are strict rules that are unconsciously followed by speakers. We do not realize that because for us, spoken languages are kind of slangs or fluid versions of languages, but there are specific rules there. A good example of that is what we call AAVE. AAVE is African American Vernacular English. Vernacular means daily life, common. So this English dialect spoken in the States is extremely rich. It is, in fact, more complex than standard English. It's more complicated. And even if people don't realize it, it includes rigorously structured grammar rules that are spoken. And I do not master AAVE, but as you can see, the small images here for what we would consider the past tense of English. There are 4 different variations in AAVE, and there are many variations of the future as well. And not only that, not only verb tenses, but there are also other rules that are unwritten. Double negations are a common aspect of African American English. For example, I don't go nowhere. I don't read no book. Also, they will avoid clusters of consonants. Example, a test in plural makes tests. So it has 3 consonants in a row, STS, tests. This is extremely hard to pronounce when someone speaks a West African language, so they will turn it into tesses, which is much easier. It's smoother to pronounce. Same thing, the S, the final S at the third person singular is very often removed because this S specifically creates clusters of consonants like he talks. The K and S sound together do not pronounce well, so it's he talk. So it's much smoother doesn't is also problematic here. And it comes from centuries ago when speakers, the early English speakers among slave populations were still speaking these West African pidgins. So the creation of African American English is very ancient, very structured, and much more complex than standard English, in fact. And you don't have to know all these examples in any test. What you have to remember here is that spoken languages follow specific rules as well. Another example of precise rules in spoken language is Québécois, French-Canadian language. We don't care so much about studying these unwritten rules here, but a lot of scholars in Europe are very interested in the Québécois language. There are actually PhD dissertations written about us and how we speak in Quebec. One example of these rules we don't even know, and I'm a specialist of that. I was born in Matane, where we actually speak like that. If I want to say I go in French, it is je vais. If I want to say I will in French, it is also je vais. But I don't speak like that. I never say that, je vais. Even today, I don't live there anymore, but I still kept my language. When I say to my kids, je vais travailler, I say je vais travailler. This is the way we speak. And there is another way in Québécois to say je vais when we mean I will. It is me. People where I was born speak like that. For example, m'a te péter la gueule, as in I will break your face. This is pure slang, pure dialect. And there is more rule on that. If I want to say I will, I can say je vais as well. But if I want to go, I say I go, I cannot say me. So this is a pretty complex grammar rule that we don't realize at all. But it is there in spoken language. These two buttons here are two hyperlinks to two very short videos. They're about 4 minutes each, and you should watch them before you hear what I have to explain here. If you have watched these videos, the first one is from Fox News. You know Fox News, huh? And the second one is from JSU, Georgia State University. There are linguists speaking there. And these are two very different points of view on what a spoken dialect here is. They use the example of the dialect of AAVE, African American English. And they agree on one thing. They agree on the fact that young African Americans must master standard English in order to be successful in life, in order to be well integrated in the system, to have successful academic career, and to have successful life in the workforce. But this is probably the only thing they agree on. For the rest, they totally disagree on the nature of African American English. And what is true for African American English is also true for other spoken dialects in the world, spoken by minorities. Québécois is in the same category here. We cannot at all compare the past of French Canadians and the past of African Americans. We don't have the same level of suffering at all. But for the dialect, we can compare a little bit. They disagree on the nature of the dialect. Fox News, the guy in Fox News, clearly says that AAVE is something that should be eliminated. It's something that should not be spoken by the next generations. It is bad grammar. It's wrong. People are not, he's not proud of it. And the white principal of the school even says it's poor language. kids are showing poor language skills. So it's something negative for this author speaking in the Fox News video here. On the other side, the Georgia State University people have a very different point of view here. And this point of view is shared by most anthropologists. They say that AAVE is something that they should be proud of. And something very important, they say it defines their identity. Language is one of the most powerful ways to define someone's identity, to show who you are. And they say that kids, of course, they should master standard English, as Québécois should master standard French. But they kind of promote this biculturalism. They say they should know both. They should not be sacrificing their own culture when they learn standard English. They should be proud of that dialect they are part of and keep it alive. So you see the different, the contradictory points of view here on dialects. And this is true for a lot of dialects spoken in the world. As you know, languages are alive. They change. They are born, they change, and then they die. We will see in the next slides how languages emerge, what makes them change, and how they're dying right now. So let's start with the emergence of languages. Today in the world, there are around 6,600 languages spoken, and this number is rapidly decreasing. These languages we speak today around the world emerged from what we call proto-languages. A proto-language, the definition is not written here. A proto-language is an old language, not spoken anymore, that gave birth to languages we speak today. Some proto-languages are more recent, so we still have traces of them. Think of Latin, for example. Some older proto-languages are so old that we lost trace of them. One example of that is Proto-Indo-European. It's a hypothetical language. It existed, but we cannot find the words because there is no one recorded these languages. And these very old languages gave birth to younger proto-languages and to today's languages. So it's like a tree of evolution, but for languages instead of living beings or living species. These 300 proto-languages were spoken, and this is also a hypothetical number. We don't know the exact number of proto-languages, but the number 300 goes with 10,000 years ago. How do we know that? No one has a time machine. No one was there 10,000 years ago to know how many languages were spoken in the world. We know that because of a science called glottochronology. This is not in the test. It's just to tell you that I'm not making up these numbers. Glottochronology is a little bit like the genetics of evolution, but for languages. It is done with series of words in today's languages and how they're similar and how they have changed through time, so we can go back in time to see parent languages and how they evolved. It's a complex science, but let's remember that not a lot of languages were spoken in the world a long time ago, about 10,000 years ago. And this number of languages increased tremendously between 10,000 years ago and a few hundred years ago. It increased because, first, of a rise in population. You remember from the beginning of the semester that 10,000 years ago was a time when agriculture was adopted in the world and spread on all continents. So agriculture caused a rise in population worldwide. So this population traveled throughout the territory and colonized new territories. But 10,000 years ago, up to a few hundred years ago, we had very slow communication technologies and transportation technologies. So when these populations spread on the territory, they remained isolated in different environments, across mountains, across oceans, on islands, and spreading there and staying isolated in different physical environments, but also social environments with different neighbors, with different contacts. They developed specific local languages, and these languages remained. Languages change all the time. A language that does not change is a dead language. So languages change because of many reasons. The first reason why languages change is the same reason why they're born. It's because of dispersion of people on the territory and isolation of speakers in different environments. Take the example of Spanish. During the 15th century, Spanish speakers colonized lands in Central and South America. So people stayed isolated in the Americas during centuries after, with few contacts with Europe. You don't call home, you don't Skype home every day in the 16th century, and you don't fly home every weekend. So people stayed really isolated with different neighbors in different social, cultural contexts, in different physical environment. So their Spanish changed. So the Spanish you hear in Latin America is not the same Spanish you hear in Spain. People have different phonemes. People have different ways of constructing their sentences, of using pronouns, of even conjugating verbs. Spanish spoken in different countries of Latin America are very similar versions of Spanish, and Spanish spoken in Spain is more different because it's further and it's more isolated. New communication technologies have also brought important changes in languages over the last 20 years, especially activities like texting and tweeting have brought changes in the English language, for example. We don't build our sentences anymore the same way. We don't use punctuation the same way. We have a totally different way to build a text, a short text in English. And this is changing the language. Some people like it, some people don't, some people are neutral, some are scandalized. Oh my goodness, this is ruining the English language. Some see it as a natural change in the language. It depends on the opinion people have. But for sure, new technology changes the language. Also, it brings new words and new ways to use pre-existing words. No one was unfriending or texting or sexting people 20 years ago. So these are new verbs used in the language, for example. New social realities bring new terms in languages. They don't really influence grammatical constructions, although they can, but a lot of terms are added. An example of how they have changed grammatical constructions is the recent accepted use of they as a singular pronoun, as a gender neutral singular pronoun. Now, gender neutrality is important in society and it has an effect on the English language. New political situations or relationships between countries or new um, ecologic realities on the planet. Uh, any kind of new situation will bring new terms in the language. Brexit is a good example of it. No one was using it before a few years ago, but now it is a necessary term to describe a political situation. The word jihad was not an English word originally, it's Arabic, but it was borrowed by the English language. because we needed a word to describe a situation that we did not know before, and we borrowed the word from the Arabic, and now we use it the English way. New situations like climate change will also bring new terms. Examples, carboneutre in French, carbon footprint in English, um, Flygscam in Sweden is a word used to express a new reality, which is the shame of flying. It was not lived by people a decade ago, but now we know that flying creates so much carbon emissions that we developed a shame of traveling and we have to pay back. So that's a new word. Trumpism is an interesting example. It recently appeared in the language to express a new way of doing politics that did not exist before, and that word might really well stay in the language. The pandemic also brought a lot of new terms that might really well stay in the English language, like quarantini or covidiot, which I like a lot. Um, there is an interesting word in German, Hamsterkauf, that existed before. It's not a new word, but now it has a very precise use, which is panic buying or panic herding of goods for the future. And this is used a lot right now. So these are words that are around us because of the pandemic that would not be there otherwise. The fourth and also very important reason why languages change today have changed in the past, it's because of contact between speakers of different languages. This contact can be positive, like trade was a major reason why languages have changed, diplomatic relations, and today tourism, immigration are positive aspects why when languages change, but also there are so negative contacts between populations, such as conquests or international conflicts. Uh, we call interference when new words are integrated into a language, new words that come from foreign languages. For example, the word chocolate in English was borrowed from Nahua people from central Mexico in the 1500s. It was first integrated in the Spanish language. So when Spanish conquistadores, when Spanish soldiers uh, tried a beverage made with cocoa, they thought it was really good. So they asked local people, "What's that?" And they said it is chocolatl. Chocolatl is kind of impossible to pronounce in Spanish, so they have changed it to chocolate, which is much easier to pronounce. And then they traveled back to Europe with that nice beverage, and it was borrowed in English, chocolate, and in French, chocolat, and in all languages of Europe, and then it traveled back elsewhere in the world. But this originally is a native word from central Mexico. A lot of words we use in English here in Canada are not originally English words. And we do think they're English words, but think of orange, sugar. These are Arabic words. Pajamas, jungle, bungalow. These are words from India and neighboring countries. Words like rum, canoe, coyote, avocado are words from Aboriginal populations of the Americas. A banana is definitely an English word. It's a Mandingo word from Africa. We borrowed a few hundred years ago and integrated into the English language. And the list goes on. There are hundreds and hundreds of words in English that were not originally English words. But contact between speakers of different languages did not only bring the borrowing of words, it also brought the real creation from scratch of new languages. And this happened very quickly, or relatively quickly, in the time of the first navigations where people started crossing oceans for the first times and creating exchange and trade networks around shores of oceans. And at that time, a lot of new languages were created in the world because of the need of speakers from different languages to communicate with each other. This happened around shores of continents and countries where people were having close contacts with each other. And the first step in the creation of these new languages is called pidgin. A pidgin is a language, a new language, that blends elements of at least two different parent languages. A pidgin is created not because people want it, because people need it. They do not speak the same language. They really have to communicate with each other, so they will create this kind of hybrid language. In the 15th, 16th centuries, people did not have Google Translate, they did not have translators, so they did the best they could. Pidgins were limited to a specific domain, and this domain was trade. Trade of goods and, sadly, trade of human beings, slavery. Pidgins were rudimentary language. Rudimentary means simple. You don't bother with fancy stuff when you use a pidgin. You go right to the point. Your only goal is to conclude a transaction between two people. It's no one's native language. You don't teach that to your kids. You use it when you need. Example, imagine you don't have any translator or phone, you're an English speaker, you speak only English, and there is this really nice Serbian person that speaks only Serbian, and you want to take that person out to the movies. So you will not bother doing very complex fancy sentences with verb tenses and adjectives, and you will just say me, you, movie, tonight, and hopefully the person will understand. So this was kind of the nature of pidgins centuries ago when they were created. Me buy boat 3 gold pieces. And the person says, no, 4. And then you communicate back and forth using some small elements of both languages the best you can. This is called a pidgin. Of course, pidgins are not developed anymore in the world. We have technology to translate, and also we have English, which is the universal trade language. But centuries ago, people around the world did not speak that common, what we call lingua franca, and that common language everyone knows more or less to trade. So pidgins were developed because of that. Pidgins did not live very long in the past. When they were used extensively during years and decades, they rapidly transformed or evolved into what we call creoles. Now, when I say the word Creole, you immediately think about Haiti, because the native language the official language of Haiti is Creole. It is called Creole, but it is one of many Creoles spoken in the world. A Creole is same thing as a pidgin. It's a language that blends elements of two parent languages, but it's the only common thing with a pidgin. It comes from a pidgin, but it's much more complex. Creoles are true languages with all the design features of human languages. They are very complex. They have all these fancy things we have in English, or sometimes even more complex, with complex verb tenses, adverb, adjectives, and syntaxes and everything we know. They're used for all domains of daily life, not only trade. They're used for schooling, they're used for poetry, they're used for all aspects of life, and they are people's native language. So Creoles are true official languages that come from parent languages from which they developed in the past. So how were Creoles created from pidgins? They were created by people, very often against their will, and sometimes unconsciously. It was a natural process. A Creole has a natural birth process that lasts a few generations. I will take the example of the Caribbean to explain how Creoles were born, because it's closer to us. You probably know people that who come from the Caribbean, and it's an area of the world we know well, and it's an area of the world where many different Creoles are spoken. Creoles were shaped centuries ago during the slave trade. And their creation was pushed by slave traders that were evil and smart in their way of being evil. They were buying slaves from different origins and different native languages, so these slaves would not be able to communicate with each other, so they would not be able to organize a rebellion. But slaves were smarter than that. They did organize ways to communicate with each other by naturally creating these creoles, with which they were also able to communicate with local non-free people around. So a creole is composed of two things, any creole. This first thing is a superstrate. A superstrate is a language of the colonizer. In the case of the Caribbean, there are 5 languages that were used in the past as superstrates: French, English, Spanish, Portuguese, and Dutch to a lesser extent. There might be a little bit of Italian as well in the past, but very limited. These European languages, these languages of colonizers, provide the vocabulary of the Creole. And the second language of the Creole is the local language, the language of the people who were forced into slavery, the local African language or the local language of the Caribbean. In this case here, we call these languages substrates. These substrates, in the case of the Caribbean, come from West Africa. Major substrates are Wolof, Fulani. These are languages that were used in the creation of Caribbean Creoles. And these African languages, these languages of the colonized, provided the grammar of the Creole. On the next slide, the left picture shows Haitian Creole. It's a French-based Creole. So the superstrate here is French, and the substrate comes from West Africa. So you can read comment nous utiliser de l'eau. So you recognize French really well. French speakers can read and understand that because these are French vocabulary words. But the grammar does not make sense to us because it's based on West African aspects. On the right, you can see something written in Patois. Patois is the Creole spoken in Jamaica. It's an English-based Creole. So the superstrat here is English, but the substrat is also based on West African languages. So on the right, the resolution is not really good, but you can read the good news about Jesus according to Luke. So it's the gospel. It's in English. You can understand that. You can read that if you speak English, but the grammar is very different. It's a West African grammar. And languages die. They are dying right now at a very fast pace in the world. They die because of many reasons. The first reason that was especially present in the past, maybe a little bit less today, but still it is present today, it's conquest and colonization of populations. And also national official policies of assimilation. Let's take the example of Canada, of North America. Before the European conquest here, about 700 languages were spoken by Aboriginal populations. Not 700 dialects, 700 languages. That's a lot of them. And we can expect 3 of them to survive the next decades. They're Ojibwe, Cree, and Inuktitut. So these 3 languages will survive because they are spoken by more than 10,000 people. When a language is spoken by less than 10,000 speakers, we consider this language to be in danger. When I was studying at University of Montreal, at the Department of Anthropology, I met the very last speaker of one of these first languages spoken in Canada. And the guy was already old at that time. He's probably dead today. So the language died with him. He was the last speaker. So he was working in recording his voice and writing a grammar with audio, with an anthropologist. So at least a trace was left of this language before it died. So this is pretty common right now. French in Quebec is not in danger. Huh? It's spoken by about 6 to 7 million people, so it will not disappear. We're not in danger of assimilation, of linguistic assimilation, not at all. Some people are very unhappy because the language is changing right now. French is changing because of all foreign influences. But that's a natural, normal process. Languages change, whether we like it or not. So French is not really in danger. Policies of assimilation for First Nations were in place in Canada, have been in place here for about 1 century. You have heard of residential schools where children of First Nations were forced to go and they were prohibited to speak their native language. Authorities here in Canada understood really well that if you remove someone's language, you remove someone's culture. It's the best and quickest way to kill a culture, by killing a language. And it worked. Kids lost the ability to speak their native language. They taught French or English to their children, and the goal was achieved. We cannot go back with that. It's really hard to go back. There is some revitalization movements, but the work is done. So policies of assimilation are very efficient, were very efficient to kill languages, and by extension to kill cultures. It happened to a lesser extent in Russia during the Soviet era. Russian speakers were sent in villages up north in Russia to teach Russian to people. People became bilingual. It worked during a certain time, but the Soviet era did not last long enough to kill these local languages. Globalization is another factor for the death of languages. People will use English more, and their native language after a few generations might be in danger. I've seen that in Peru a lot. I've been working there during more than 10 years. In my first year, in some very remote villages, speakers were bilingual. They were speaking Quechua, their native language, their Aboriginal language, and some of them were speaking English. Now they have built the government has built a road to go to these villages, which is good for villagers because they became wealthier, they have access to the formal economy around. It's a process of globalization. But in a sense, now kids are learning English in schools and not Quechua. Quechua is not in danger. It's spoken by millions of people. But you see the process going on here. The globalization promotes the spread of English in the world, and this can cause the death of some small-scale languages.